Last week, we had a lot to say about China, and I drew attention to the Lowy Institute poll, which found that only 32% of Australians trust China to act responsibly in the world. That's down from 52% last year. 70% say we should try to prevent Beijing's growing influence in the Pacific. 75% said we're too economically dependent on China because it is the main destination for our resource exports. They own in Australia our mineral resources, our water, our dairy farms, our beef farms, our avocado farms, our paddock to their plate. 1/3 of the $35 billion in our education export income is from China. They're increasingly aggressive in the South China Sea, and there have been revelations about sophisticated state actors using cyber means to attack our parliament, as well as Liberal, Labor and National Party headquarters. There has been talk of cyber security infiltration in Australia, including the ANU's IT network. And we had this almost farcical decision 4 years ago, where Landbridge, a Chinese outfit, was given a 99-year lease over the port of Darwin. It has close ties to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. Well, 4 years on, the strategic challenges have changed. Last week, Andrew Hastie, the young and outstanding Liberal MP for the West Australian seat of Canning, went as far as to call the modern-day leader in China, President Xi Jinping, a modern-day Stalin. And he warned that Australia was like a complacent France, even as German tanks rolled towards its border in 1940. Make no mistake, we are in serious territory here. Hong Kong airport closed again. And have a look at what protesters are handing out at the airport. Welcome to the city, it says, of expired tear gas. Hong Kong is not safe. That's the document they get. Hong Kong, police brutality 2019, shot a female first aider, permanent vision lost, shot a teacher in the eye, permanent visual impairment, launched chemical warfare with expired tear gas, fire tear gas at elderly houses, fired tear gas indoors at a metro station. This is what they're told as they land in Hong Kong airport. Shot a group of protesters at less than 1 metre close range, exposed a female protester's private parts in public, attacked and arrested pedestrians, social workers, first aiders and journalists, searched protesters' homes and university dorms without a licence. This is going on now. Arrested more than 600 protesters aged 14 to 76. Well, yesterday, the defence analyst Peter Jennings, the executive director of the Australian Strategic Institute, told a Canberra conference it was time Australian universities made tough choices about joint research with mainland Chinese academics. Now, you might remember a couple of weeks ago, it was reported that a University of New South Wales computer science professor, Zhu Jingling, co-authored 15 research papers which could assist China's nuclear weapons program. The co-author was the Chinese general Yang Yuzhun. General Yang is an academic at China's National University of Defence Technology. He's president of China's Academy of Military Science, and he's a member of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. Professor Zhu is an Australian citizen who receives taxpayer-funded research grants. As an Australian, is it appropriate for him to be working with Chinese generals to develop technologies with potential military uses? Forgive me for thinking we might be asleep at the wheel here. Surely this merits significant discussion. As John Garneau, an Australian, a Mandarin speaker, former Beijing correspondent with the Sydney Morning Herald, said recently, the key point about Communist Party ideology, the unbroken thread that runs from Lenin through Stalin, Mao and Xi, is that the party is and always has defined itself as being in perpetual struggle with the hostile forces of Western liberalism. Well, now, of course, Andrew Hastie argued this week the next decade will test our democratic values, our economy, our alliances and our security like no other time in Australian history. James Brown is a former president of the RSL in New South Wales. He's young, 39 years of age. He joined the Australian Army from the University of Sydney. He was a troop commander in Iraq for a good stretch. He was part of the Special Operation Forces in Afghanistan. He has a Master of Arts degree from Sydney University in Strategy and Policy. He was a military fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy and is currently an adjunct associate professor at Sydney University. We thought we'd talk to a young man who, since he's left the services, has continued to serve those who have served. And given that the Lowy Institute in a recent poll, as I suggested, raised concerns about the level of trust that Australians hold towards China, and given what we're seeing in Hong Kong, let's see what James Brown makes of all of this. He joins us here. James, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Where are we?
Well, we're in a very dangerous position when it comes to what's happening in Hong Kong, and it's a test of whether China will live up to its word and whether it will honour the promises it made back in 1999 when it said it would give one country, two systems and enshrine the rule of law and basic freedoms for the citizens of Hong Kong. And that really shows just how far our discussion has come on China here. Years ago, we were relying on China to do its best and hoping that by being rich, China would be responsible. Now we're planning for the worst. We're looking at the fact that China is becoming increasingly authoritarian, that President Xi Jinping is doing World War II-like military parades in military uniforms, that the Chinese second rocket force has got nearly 2,000 missiles in the intermediate range that it's built up. Its military is increasing in size. And the question we have to ask is, what's next? Because China's political intent can change overnight.
What does that, the ships going through the strait there that's causing all the drama,
yeah.
what is the purpose of that? What do the Chinese demonstrate to us by that? Are they saying we just have the power and we can use it any time we like?
Well, if you're in President Xi Jinping's position, you've got to keep economic growth continuing, and that means you've got to think about the threats to that, whether that comes from Western democracies, and we know that there's been, John Garneau pointed to some of the writings recently coming out of the Chinese Communist Party about the threat that Western democracy can be to their system and to their government, whether it's the energy supplies that they rely on coming through the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, or whether it's about being able to project your force, build your fortresses in the South China Sea, put your ships through there and make sure that no one can push up against you or push you around. All of those things are the sorts of things you would expect a great power like China to be thinking about, but we are seeing an increasing level of militarisation and a hardening of political opinion in China's leadership that should give us concern.
Well, so just to get some flavour of where they are thinking, I noticed only last week this Defence Minister, Xi's Defence Minister, said that the 1989 decision to massacre thousands of unarmed students in Tiananmen Square was, quote, correct policy to end, quote, political turbulence. Now, we've got political turbulence in Hong Kong now. What do they think is the correct policy to end that?
Well, the protests in Hong Kong are a threat to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, of course, people in China aren't watching those protests except for what they see through the propaganda channels and through domestic media. But they will be under pressure to act. I think if you're President Xi and you think that your rule is going to be threatened, or one of your adversaries, not that there's many of them left, are going to use the protests in Hong Kong to suggest that he's not strong, then you would act and act decisively.
So taking Andrew Hastie's comment, are we today complacent? Like, are we the modern-day France as Germany mobilises itself at the border?
I think we have been complacent in our security thinking. We're in a part of the world where we don't have to think about what the military is doing or security problems or what it's like not to have freedom. And so we don't think about it all that often, and all this is happening a long way away. But Hong Kong is somewhere we know. A lot of us live there. There's 100,000 people with Australian passports there. So it's very real. And we're seeing this lack of freedom, this restriction of basic human rights playing out right in front of us in some pretty confronting scenes.
And, of course, the technology is much more sophisticated now, isn't it? It's not...
Yeah, well, what it means, the technology, of course, is it doesn't matter that it's far away.
No.
Those missiles will go a long way, won't they?
Well, we're much more enmeshed with China than we were with the Soviet Union, for example, during the Cold War. The cyber attacks, we're engaging with Chinese businesses and Chinese people all the time.
Yeah. Linda Reynolds said in London, I just have a bit of a problem here that we're not prepared to be on the front foot. We speak in sort of vague, incoherent language. Linda Reynolds, the Defence Minister, said in London last month, the longer we leave it unchecked, the bolder they become. I don't know what that means. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's saying that we need to set some boundaries. We can't let China pocket too many concessions, get away with bad behaviour. Now, of course, we're not a great country like China, but we speak with a big voice and we speak with our allies. And so I think we need to make clear that there are certain parts of the international system that we don't want to see undermined, and we certainly don't want to see influence in our democracy either.
But James, this is James Brown, who was the former president of the RSL. He has served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Where were we 4 years ago when we were giving a 99-year lease to the Chinese-affiliated company Landbridge over the port of Darwin? What the hell was going on in Canberra?
Well, that was the left hand not talking to the right hand. The state government doing what it needs to do, not talking to the federal government who's thinking about what this critical infrastructure might need to be used for and how it might be, undermined. And I think that was a bad example, but now that mistake won't happen again. Our Foreign Investment Review Board is...
Well, do we take it back? We go to China and say we want our port back.
Well,
what?
I don't think we yet...
It's a lease. We'll break the lease, pay out the lease.
We could do that. We're not yet, I think, at the point where we need to renationalise that.
But nonetheless, if you talk about Hong Kong, I was just looking here, I think this is a metaphor. Last month, the Vanuatu, little Vanuatu, because here are China promising really, well, PNG have gone to China saying, well, can you refinance our debt? It's only about 12 billion. We should be doing that. And so China are everywhere in the Pacific, and the Vanuatu Daily Post reported that 6 individuals of ethnic Chinese origin were detained in Port Vila by People's Republic of China law enforcement officials working incognito. They were held on the premises of a Chinese-owned company and then extradited from the country. This is what they're talking about doing in Hong Kong. Extradited from the country, Vanuatu, without any legal process on a chartered Chinese aircraft, I suppose, never to be seen again.
Yeah, and we're seeing that kind of battle for influence playing out all across the Pacific.
Yes.
Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, we've seen it in Fiji. They're taking military and police figures from Fiji and training them in China.
OK, now look, you're a young bloke, we're all sort of oldies here, but you're certainly academically qualified and you're practically qualified. You've been in the theatre of war, you've talked about it, you've written about it. OK, we plonk you in Canberra tomorrow. What is the first thing that needs to be done?
Talk to Australians about what's happening. There's this bashfulness about talking to Australians about foreign policy and about some of these difficult
So be open with the electorate.
Absolutely.
And we're frightened of China, basically. We don't want to offend them.
We're very indebted.
And so therefore we hold back, don't we?
Look, we do. I mean, our ally, the US, has called out China as a strategic competitor.
OK, well, one question then. Does our economic dependence, to take the point that Graham just made, does our economic dependence threaten our national sovereignty, compromise our national sovereignty?
If you added up our exports to China in coal, tourism and education, that's less than 1% of Australia's GDP. Now, that's a big move if we were to lose all of that, but it's not something that we wouldn't be willing to do to protect our own sovereignty. So we want to trade with China, we want to grow with China, but not at any cost. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having, and we have started to have.
Good on you. Great to have a fresh, young voice in all of this, I think. Keep at it. Good to talk to you, James.
Thanks very much.
James Brown.